All right, let's get started. Thank you everybody for coming. Welcome to the Variety of Religious Experience hosted by both the Oxford Psychedelic Society and the Psychedelic Society, which is a UK-wide organization. It's our first collaboration. Thank you very much to Amir Giles, who should be here in the audience, who helped us with setting up the event. I'll introduce each of the three speakers. So we're very lucky today to be joined by a panel of people from a wide range of faiths, each of whom has experience with psychedelics, particularly when it comes to facilitating their spiritual journeys. So on my left is Nikki Weird. She is the director of the charity which runs Europe's largest psychedelic conference, Breaking Convention. She's the editor of the Psychedelic Press Journal, runs the Universe Machine Publishing House, and also works as a freelance editor for books and papers related to psychedelics, occultism, anthropology, and medicine. Nikki often holds space at retreats and gives workshops centered around ritual practices. She enjoys dancing to psytrance, and as an ecologist, she actively encourages humans to reconsider how they can live in harmony with other organisms. Nikki's past roles include British Isles section head of the Chaos Magic Order, the Illuminative Thanateros, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, ecology graduate, bass player in an all-women punk band, and a single mother. Mark Schuneman has been studying the sacramentality of the relationship between drugs and culture for 7 years, having presented his research in Tallinn, Harvard, Breaking Convention, and Prague. His interests span theology, philosophy, anthropology, and literature, and considers the relationship between measurable exteriorities, immeasurable interiorities, ritual and value generation, comparativism, and natural theology. With degrees from Oxford and Durham, Mark is also a published poet and is about to pursue a PhD in comparative drug literature. His faith has led him to pursue a profession as a lay chaplain, researcher, and toy demonstrator, gardener, special needs, piano teacher, and humanitarian aid worker. He has taught psychedelic philosophy classes in London, conducted reading groups of the Rose of Paracelsus, I believe here at Oxford.
One of them was at Oxford, yeah.
And helps to conduct the Crossbones rituals for the outcasts. And finally, last but not least, Ricardo Rossi has traveled and lived across the world. Born in South Africa, having grown up in Portugal, he lives in the UK for over 20 years. Holding a PhD in architecture, he teaches and researches at Oxford Brookes University and is the father of 2 children. Spiritually, Ricardo works with different methods and traditions to be able to bring balance to life, act from a place of compassion, to integrate meaningfully with all his relations and day-to-day actions. Ricardo has been a practicing Buddhist from a Tibetan tradition since 2005 and received many certifications and transmissions. His teachings and meditation methods help him with clarity in knowing how to experience daily emotions and connect with the freedom and joy of the moment. Ricardo has also received shamanic teachings from lineages of the Amazon and the Andes. Currently, he's studying the therapeutic approach of compassionate inquiry by Dr. Gabor Mate. His practices enable him to transform and heal past traumas and bring the blind spots into view so he can operate from the heart and find balance in both masculine and feminine, inner and outer qualities. Ricardo runs retreats and ceremonies in the UK and in Portugal, helping many find their path to self-revelation. Thank you very much, guys. So just to summarize, if he's a pagan, Mark is a Christian, and Ricardo is a Tibetan Buddhist. So the format of the event, just, there's one word. So the format of the event is going to be a 60-minute moderated discussion by me, followed by 30 minutes of questions from the audience. And then afterwards, we'll head to the pub to continue the discussion. Great. So I thought that we could first start the discussion by each of you just describing your faith and how you practice it.
I guess I go first. We were just joking there slightly about the word there being a box and like a label, but the label does allow you a certain entry point into that box and a bit of a description, like, what's inside this? So it's not necessarily a totally limiting thing. So pagan, I interpret the word pagan as and how I practice it is the nature-based spirituality. So yes, it may involve deities at different points, but it's much more focused on the lived reality of the world around me, plants, animals, insects, fungi, microbes, all of those things, and people, of course. So my religious, mystical, it's hard, isn't it? Because all these words break down, especially in the psychedelic environment. But that soul manifesting thing of psychedelics is for me about the awe and the wonder in the everyday lived reality of my own existence as an organism, and also all of the organisms that I meet on a daily basis. And it's finding that awe and joy without getting too lost in it, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to go to the shops for a pint of milk. So it's about finding that and recognising that and honouring that explicitly in certain ways, in ceremonies and rituals, and then carrying that reverence and that awe and that delight in these things, and in one's own part in the web of reality and the web of life on this planet Earth. That's the thing that is the core of my spiritual beliefs. And psychedelics very much allow me to engage with that in a deliberate and very conscious way. Is that the kind of
Yes.
thing? Yes. Thank you.
Mark.
Could you repeat the question one more time? So is it how I practice my faith, or how I use psychedelics, or
How you practice your faith generally, and then we'll launch into the psychedelics.
Okay, cool. So I'm actually, to box me in further, a Christian Buddhist. Well, I learned recently there's a category called Abraham Pagans, who are Jews, Christians, and Muslims who are also pagan. Anyway, the regular community that I worship with is Christian, and I think the way in which I understand that, and forgive me for reading, I've actually had 3 hours sleep in the last 48 hours, so I've prepared something before because I knew this was going to happen.
Because he's been travelling rather than
Yeah.
for other reasons.
Yeah, not for nefarious reasons. Although I have come from California, but let's not go into it. So we can later. So as a Christian Buddhist, the meta narrative, which in this postmodern or maybe meta-modern world I unashamedly subscribe to, can be passed in this logic, basically, which is that I'll pose it as a question: if the most powerful being itself, that is, the reason we don't fall out of but stay within existence, the sustainer of all of our reality, our lives, the reason that there is something rather than nothing at all, if that being were to exist, hypothetically, what would be the most powerful thing which that being could do?
Create something in his own image.
Interesting, beautiful, the incarnation, yeah. Possibly create, yes. But for me, perhaps the unique contribution of the Christian message to the greater theological discussion of what is God would be that the most powerful thing that the most powerful being could do is actually to give up that power. You see it in Islam too. Islam means surrender, and the best way to engage with psychedelics, of course, is also to surrender, but we can go into that. I think it's logical at base. The most powerful thing, the most powerful being can do is to give up that power. And so psychedelics, well, they strengthen my faith by strengthening my agnosticism, actually, helping me give up, over attachment to categories in that way. But whereas the mechanism Foucault's of this world would say they kind of inevitably deconstruct, I think there's a reconstruction that has to happen when you interpret and explain to yourself and others what's happened, and that reconstruction often takes place in the language of faith. And so, the Christian community for me is the incarnation of God. Ideally, Christ, the body of Christ, existing as community. And the regular rhythm of that sacrament, to have that change you, is actually quite a work. It's quite a difficult thing. And of course, the church has gone wrong in so many different ways. But I would say as an ideal type, that's what it strives to be, and that's the kind of churches that I prefer to go to. So that's does that answer the question roughly?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Ricardo?
Thank you. First I'd like to say that whilst they're representing Tibetan Buddhism as a kind of note here at the bottom, I'm not an authorized teacher, I'm not a representative of any particular lineage as such, although I've been a student of a lineage in particular, and I don't stand here in representation of them. And my relationship with the daily practice, in the core of the question, is really being mindful of who I am, mindful in the way in which I am standing myself towards what is happening to me. So how do I perceive what is happening in my now? I think that's the richest kind of opportunity to engage with practice. Surrounding that, there is a relationship with meditation. And so meditation over the years has enabled me to hold an inner space. And I think the notion of holding and space kind of bring forward quite interesting ideas about how are we within the world, how are we within ourselves, and who am I? And I like that kind of the origin of those questions. I think are very rich, and I think if there is a pursuit that holds me in the now, is trying to understand who am I. And I think that's the kind of the richness of my discovery in my spiritual path. And Buddhism has helped me tremendously with that path, and so has shamanism and the relationship with psychedelics that I regularly engage with, mainly ayahuasca. So I have a continued relationship with a series of methods, but all those methods, like Nikki said right at the beginning, which is very beautiful, is my opportunity to see everything as the sacred moment of my experience. So I think that's perhaps the place I'd like to position myself in my daily practice.
Great. So now I want to discuss more deeply the role of psychedelics in each of your spiritual journeys, which each of you has touched on. And perhaps a good way to start would be to ask how you came across psychedelics. Have you come across psychedelics in a spiritual context or a non-spiritual context, and how did things develop from there?
Does someone else want to go first, so don't just do the same order?
I'll go first this time, I'll go first the third time. Sure.
So I was a very happy Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and I didn't feel like I wanted to explore anything out of that container, because that set of teachings were very important to follow the lineage and to follow the authenticity of the teachings, and that's a really important part of the way in which I pursue my spiritual path. Where is the authenticity? And having been 12, 13 years working with one particular lineage, I felt that I wanted to adhere and go deeper in with that practice. Then by chance, as one might say, I was invited to go to the Amazon to an ayahuasca space, but I was not interested in it, and I went with a great friend because it was a great adventure, and from an anthropological point of view, it sounded really great to go and visit this tribe in the Amazon, and I felt more compelled to actually go on this particular trip because my Buddhist teacher was in Peru at the time, and so it felt for me like, oh, I'm going to go see my Buddhist teacher who's actually giving a lecture in Lima at the time, and I will go and see this amazing experience of going into the jungle. And then when I did, have this experience, ayahuasca experience, I thought it was absolutely at first horrendous and really terrifying, and I really wanted to get out of that really hot hut in the middle of the night with this woman who didn't stop singing, and really unpleasant. And I had never really been someone that had a relationship with drugs, even with much of alcoholism. I kind of enjoyed my state of consciousness a lot. But I enjoyed my state of consciousness very much because meditation was giving me an opportunity to see my consciousness, and I didn't really feel like I wanted any substance to see beyond that. I really enjoyed the relationship to the Buddhist aspects that I was practicing. But then when I kind of managed to get through that kind of ordeal of kind of the high peak of the experience of the ayahuasca, what I saw beyond that was just so extraordinary, and I got an understanding of the reality of the nature of mind, of the universe, of kind of a sort of a cosmic understanding of things that I had never really experienced, and I saw a sort of a clairvoyance of myself, and a real depth of wisdom and access to information that was just there at the tip of my finger. That was just incredible, and I realized there was something really phenomenal that was there that I could learn from. So it wasn't a pursuit for anything kind of entertaining, but it was really this pursuit. Wow, there's something here which is absolutely profound. And that took me, and since then, I've taken on that journey to really kind of have a deeper relationship with ayahuasca. And I'm not really interested in any of the other psychedelics. I'm kind of a long-term relationship kind of person. So less of one-night stands with certain medicines and so on. And now I'm just fascinated by what I'm learning from it, and so that I'm compelled very, very much to that.
Can I just ask out of curiosity, when you did that first ayahuasca experience, and when you were going through that, was there a point where you found yourself meditating in the way that the ayahuasca accentuated that? Was that really
Yeah, thank you. No, exactly. Because what I entered into that space in my meditation posture, and kind of like, come on, show me Buddhist, show me the real thing. I really want to see the nature of mind. Show me the kind of real. And I would kind of stop with this kind of folkloric, all these colours and all this more the woman sang like on a fun fair, you know, she like this roller coaster.
Yes.
The lady sits and the go-karts, you know, she kind of got this little, the more she pushes, the more the light comes, and well, stop with this kind of folklore, the real things, you know, even the Buddhist. And that was such a slap, and I got such a whack, terrible experience because I was so arrogant. How arrogant was I, you know, to expect, to ask for such things, you know, to have a position of superiority in it. So, no, I learned very quickly to bow down. It took me some time, it wasn't very quickly. My stubbornness led me a long time, it's taken 2 years for me to actually kind of heal.
If you want help with integrating that, that kind of like, there is a Western cynicism to ceremony, which I also feel, even as a Christian, when I had my first, what they call medicine work ceremony, I really struggled to get into it because of how earnest it was. And as you say, yeah, fanfare, folkloric almost, I like that phrase. There's a great book that might help you integrate this by one of the main founders of the theatre of cruelty movement, Antonin Artaud, called the Peyote Dance, and it's hilarious. It's so funny because he's going into this. He's an arrogant. Let's just say he's a thespian. He's an arrogant Parisian thespian playwright guy, and he's going into this like culture that he only kind of dimly half understands, thinking that he knows it all, thinking that this is all just some kind of performance, or only a performance, only a surface. And yet he stares when the priest starts singing really through the cracks into what is real. But because he maintains that stance, he actually ends up in a lunatic asylum. That's my theory anyway. But that is what happened to him. And I think it's because he couldn't have that kind of humility, that surrender to. And I think it's true that the deeper you go into the particular, the more universal truths start to pan out. Whereas there is a kind of facile element to like dotting around too many different traditions at once, I think, definitely. Because all these traditions have ancient lineages and it's important to do that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that fanfare folklore thing, I totally get it. So, as I understand it, there are broadly like, if we can categorize 3 ways in which psychedelics are done in the West, or engaged with or related to in the West. And I've engaged in all 3. There's the more recreational, which can include a trip in the woods with friends, it can include festivals and raves, but kind of less or either non-structured or loosely structured. Then you have the more, shall we say, clinical, which is the reason they're becoming kind of normalized and standardized, and the Renaissance is afoot. And then you have the ceremonial. And through my experiences with all 3, and this is kind of what my PhD's about, but it's because I've just really felt this, and I'd really love it if you guys disagree or want to qualify this, because I've been thinking about this for a while. I've gradually come to understand that the less or more loosely structured experiences, raves, festivals, forests, films, art galleries, can help us in letting go of toxic, Californian ideology, self-limiting beliefs kind of stuff. But by contrast, more ceremonial and religious settings, those with a decorated portal, where you enter and leave the space, the whole space is sacralized, and no dark spirits can enter the space, or if it does get difficult, then that's kind of something for you to deal with, and everyone's there for your healing, rather than turn up at whatever time with whatever drugs. The more structured experiences leave one kind of more implotted into a narrative, into a story. And that's not to say that can't happen in a rave, say, if you go with cherished friends and you're gonna, you have good party hygiene and you look after each other. But then again, that becomes more ceremonial almost. So for me, actually, what's interesting is I wouldn't say either of these is better than the other. They kind of require one another. So yeah, deconditioning always comes with a dialectical necessity to recondition and to understand your experience. So both are important at different points in our lives. And in my personal life, they have quite a dialectical relationship. They help to integrate each other, if that makes sense. So yeah, to see a landscape in the churning tendrils of some greater mind behind and within it all, as I did during my second year at Oxford, just up the river from Folly Bridge, is to see something that one cannot unsee. Many New Agers will talk about the connection to source and occultists experience the manifold spirits that dwell between. But you can't, fundamentally, you can't unsee a tree spirit. When you've seen a tree spirit, it's etched in your mind forever, even in sober mind. It will always be there, albeit hidden. So even if one later convinces oneself, as I sometimes have, in the vein of a skeptic, that we were simply messing around with perceptual apparati, governing pareidolia or pattern recognition. I didn't actually see faces in the tree spirits. They were like trees being trees, as trees are trees with branches and leaves, but they were more conscious than I'd ever seen them before. It still remains the case that this wonder of creation and what the mind is capable of, that the universe has a mind at all, in that it never fails to enchant you. So do you want to go into some specific examples? I've spoken enough. So like in an art gallery, for example, you'll find if you're on psychedelics in an art gallery, the paintings turn into windows. I know you'll hate this reference, Nikki, we've spoken about this, but it is a bit like Harry Potter, I'm afraid. And I do agree with your critique of Harry Potter, by the way, but I'm just using that because that's a relatable simile, yeah. So they turn into windows, and the enmeshedness of the artist's hand and the interpreter's gaze is very evident. So, or is it the enmeshedness of that, or is it an altogether parallel reality that you're seeing? And sometimes those two options even blur. So, one time I was in Dulwich Picture Gallery, and Rembrandt's Girl in Window encountered me and my friend. Her expression was changing from happy to sad to flirtatious to innocent to knowing to not knowing. All the polarities of emotion, and sometimes she was changing as if she was an independent entity, and sometimes her face was changing, like our interpretation of her face was changing in slow motion, so that we were seeing working through our own mind in reaction to this. And the wall behind the painting started bouncing up and down, and when I told my friend this, he was like, "You know what, Mark, I'm getting that too." And at that moment, she winked at both of us at the same time. So, had we just worked ourselves into an interpretative state where such a synchronicity or coincidence, such a triangulation event became possible? Or was there someone behind there kind of knowing all along what we were discussing and saying, finally, you've got it, kind of thing? And what's the difference? But in waking life, moment by moment, there is a difference, and it's enchanting, that endless question. In another portrait gallery, I saw the adoration of the Magi, and I think I'll stop with this one, with this example. And I can talk about more later. But these are not. This is kind of a bit more religious, because it was Gossert's adoration of the Magi. You should look it up later. But it moved me in a way that I hadn't quite been moved before, because the setting of the painting was this abandoned and ruined cathedral, right? So you have this ruined cathedral. Either time had worn it away, or there'd been some war or some conflict. And in the cathedral was this shining princess with her child, so the Madonna and child, Mary and Jesus, and three exotic, regally clad foreigners presenting these rich gifts. But what got me about the painting was where their gaze was concentrated. Their proud and complacent smiles lay upon the gifts themselves, rather than the incarnation of spirit in matter, rather than in the child, Christ. So the pride of this possession was blinding them to the greater point of their giving. And I've always loved the story of the Magi, because it implies a relationship between the kind of grand meta-narrative of Christianity with narratives outside of itself, like the Zoroastrian. That's what Magi means. It's a Persian priest. The Semitic meta-narrative of the Messiah combines with the Indo-European religion of Zoroaster in that story, and I really like that. But the Magi were these foreign Persian priests, and they saw in the very handiwork of creation, in the stars, they saw a kind of beam coming towards the truth that is kind of true for everyone, or supposed to be true for everyone. And so, I think that's kind of a risk that can sometimes happen with psychedelics. Basically, sometimes you can. It's what Christians distinguish. They distinguish between, or I think most religions would distinguish between the idol and the icon, the distraction and the window. So money, sex, statues can be as much conduits towards, doing good in the world, becoming a better person, realizing your present state of mind. All these things, they can help, they can guide you towards that. They can also distract you, if that makes sense. What was interesting, I didn't quite catch that message until later on in my life, when I realized recreational use was becoming a little bit mindless, shall we say, and they were becoming a distraction. And that's when I moved into ceremonial work. But I will stop talking now, and we can talk about that later.
So just to clarify, you're saying that with psychedelics, it's easy to get trapped in the icon.
In the idol.
In the idol.
To idolize them rather than iconize them. An icon is it points you towards a deeper reality, whereas an idol is like something which might. I mean, this is just the traditional Christian rendering. Other people may have different words for those two things, but I think they are distinct. And what's interesting is the same thing can be both, you know. And the classic hang-up that the church has and got often so wrong and has been so abusive with is sex and money. But psychedelics also, I think, and any or art of any kind.
It's the metaphor of the finger pointing at the moon, isn't it?
That's it. That's the Buddhist rendering. Yeah.
Finger.
Nice.
So my experience with psychedelics started off very much in a recreational way, with mushrooms, in a shared house I lived in Colchester. It was an interesting house to live in. And the people it was autumn, we picked some mushrooms, like, we're going to have mushroom tea, brilliant. And they all decided to go off and get some chips from the chip shop, and they left me there. We had a video, this is a long time ago, back in the late 80s. So I was left behind with the video recorder because we were trying to record Monty Python's Meaning of Life, which was on the telly, and we wanted to record it. So we had a copy of it on the video. So I was there to press pause when the adverts came on. So they left me, first time on mushrooms, and I was like, it was like, I was in this lovely house where I lived. It was like really tiny terraced house full of like buckle surfers pictures and posters and mannequins dressed in gold jackets, and it was just like really extraordinary, sort of like a communal house. So I'm there surrounded by all this sort of like stuff, and avidly paying attention to the TV thing. I've not seen this film before, but it's just brilliant, and the lights all get brighter and everything's like, what's going on? Someone's lit some candles. Oh, it's really amazing. So I was like, this is great. And then like really paying attention to the film. It's really funny to watch, obviously. Anyway, when you're tripping on mushrooms for the first time, it was fantastic, especially when it comes out of the fridge and it's all like, you're standing on a planet that's evolving, etc. It was just like, you can imagine how good that was. But as the evening wore on, they didn't come back from the chip shop. Where are they? And there were no phones in those days. They didn't exist. So I'm sitting there going, where's everybody? They haven't come back. What's going on? And then it all got a bit like, and then as I was watching it, the film it gets a bit darker and a bit boring as well as it goes on. And then the adverts started to become more and more fascinating. I was like, these adverts are just so like parodies and stereotypes and real windows into the psychology of the culture that I live in, the spiritual, like the shallowness of the things that they're trying to sell to us. And I was like, these are important cultural artifacts, so I'm not going to not record them. And that's how the evening went on for me. But that was my first experience of life. And then everyone came back from the chip shop and they were all like, very well, and then it was all like lovely. So it was all just a really sort of ordinary recreational experience.
What happened when you watched the recording back with the
They were really angry adverts. And of course, from my point of view, because I had no context of that sort of revelatory thing, it was just like, that was really dumb of me. So it was just boring adverts about cereal.
You looked into it deeply at the time.
At the time, they were very, very sort of like the nuclear family and the sort of perfect grinning children and parents and all of that kind of stuff. It was just like, oh my God, I've seen it for the first time.
Right.
And they're very sort of like they live with the glasses. So that was my first experience, and then cut to a bit later on, I had my first experience with acid. I won't go into all the details of that, but the end part of it, I was on my own because the other people I was with had fallen asleep, and so I was like there, and the sun was coming up, and it had been a sort of interesting night. But as the sun came up, I became aware of the sun coming up everywhere on the planet from that line, so all the way down sort of Africa, and I could see the savannas and the animals and the noises of the thing, and then I sort of had this feel of how the dawn carries on forever. This is before the KLF, so before the eternal dawn thing, but this is what I actually saw. I could really hear the animals in my head and see the changing of the light. And that was a really important spiritual moment for me. And it's something that I've returned to again and again and again on many occasions. I've watched the sun come up whilst tripping in fields and cities and in different countries around the world. And the way that this eternal dawn goes around our planet all the time and just links everything together, just one precious moment, constantly repeating. For me, that was a really important. It was a religious experience because it wasn't something that I planned or anything. And it was really interesting what you were saying about the 3 ways of taking psychedelics, like the recreational, ceremonial, and the more clinical, medical. And it's interesting that whichever way you enter the psychedelic state, you quite often end up in one or others of the other types of it.
Definitely that word, yeah.
Definitely. And having as the journal, the editor of the Psychedelic Press Journal, we quite often we sometimes print historical reports of trips as well as modern day ones. And it's very interesting to see how people enter the psychedelic realm as an experiment and end up laughing lots. There was a very good example of an American person back at the beginning of the 19th century who did this with Nestle, and they wanted to see what would happen. So they did this very serious experiment with some friends of theirs, and they all had this, and then they all ended up like rolling around on the floor laughing, and one of them was pretending to be something else, and they just had a great time, really good. But then other times you'll take it in a much more light-hearted way and end up having a very, very important transcendental and very ritualised experience that just emerges out of that thing. And the same thing happens with the clinical stuff as well. And I think that's something that at the moment is really coming to the fore with the psychedelic chaplaincy stuff, which you know much more about than I do. And also the sort of the ceremonial, the way that people are being drawn to that from the clinical world, because we've proven that they're safe and that they don't make people go crazy and that they can be used really usefully for people. But one of the important things, like the paper that was sent round to us to read, one of the important things about the success of therapeutic approach, a medicinal approach to taking psychedelics, one of the important measures of that is how mystical is the experience. And so the clinical world is now massively turning its focus and its gaze onto the ceremonial world and going, what is it that makes the mystical happen? And that's dangerous, but also, I think, in the end, if it's managed well, could be healthy, because there are many things that you can learn from that, because the ceremonial world, the ritual world of the occultist, the pagan, all the different other chaplains and other types of religious ceremonies that we have, all of those are to do with enhancing certain states of awareness, and that's the technology that psychedelic use needs to be good at doing. So why not use those lessons from other things? It's about doing it with recognition, with validation, and without taking them from those and then using them without paying literally or ethically paying homage to places that wouldn't get that. And that's the I think the point that we're at. It's quite interesting in the psychedelic world at the moment. It's something that we're going to be addressing at the next Breaking Convention Day in July.
Is that a question of appropriation?
It is very much a question of appropriation, but in a very real sense, as well as a sort of it is
right.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Can I jump in on some of what Nikki said? So so many things came up there. I mean, the first question I've been asking a lot is, does medicine lack, polemically put, and I ask doctors in here to answer this, does medicine lack a culture? You know, obviously there is such a thing as a culture, everything humans do is cultural, but does it lack, it lacks songs, it lacks art, it lacks everything that brings the psychedelic experience, to the fore, really. The only thing it does have is a wonder, it has wonder. And it has a particular method for reducing and understanding the neurological side of these states. But yeah, clinical practitioners that I've met, especially in the US, themselves have ceremonial experience, and will bring that. And is there a difference between like a shaman or a roadman or the water drummer or whatever, constantly being there, present with you, beating this drum at 130 beats per minute, or indeed to some extent the DJ, the live producer in the rave? is there a difference between that and a pre-programmed kind of Spotify playlist with eye shades? Initially, I wanted to really polemically wall those apart. But actually, what I started to learn is that people come up with these playlists with their doctors, and there is a general rule. It goes from chill to hectic to chill, basically.
Yes. That's very well set up.
Right, and so there is a negotiation afoot, and that playlist is unique to you, right? But I would say there are certain types of people with particular forms of very deep trauma that need that. But for those of us maybe who would struggle in a recreational context because they might get a bit anxious or whatever, but they don't necessarily have deep trauma, I think the ceremonial route is incredibly almost. I used to say psychedelics aren't for everyone and try not to preach it, but I would say in the ceremonial context they could be for every single personality type, because everyone's there for each other's healing, and there's no in that sense there's very little that can go wrong, because there are such experienced people that put there. If the space is held properly and there's a lineage, right? I mean, and yeah, from a cynical perspective, it might be called, brainwashing, but I don't think it is. Obviously, there are, I mean, I think
that's what if you're brainwashing people to think that
it's like it's brainwashing people to think
those things, different kind of thing.
So exactly, and so go on.
I think one of the things about the medical, clinical stuff that's been happening up until now has been very much research-based rather than totally looking at the best way of doing these things. And we're starting to see this shift towards maybe doing things in groups, maybe doing things outside, rather than in a more controlled environment where the data needs to be collected and kept very clean. And I think that certainly, as you said, a lot of the people that are running these things spend time in the desert around fire and are not just.
I mean, so harm reduction, not just harm reduction, but benefit promotion, perhaps. Because these people, you're right, they'll go for 12 days without food or water. Maybe they'll get a mango halfway through, but some of these practitioners, you've learned so. How much more would you learn from those 12 days than 2 years in theological college? This is a different type of religious education that these people are engaged in, and they ought to be carefully, background checked, but generally trusted quite deeply, I think.
I wanted to bring Ricardo into the
I was
conversation.
going to say a few things here. I think there's an importance to focusing on the intention. I think that's not being recognized importantly here, because yes, all these things can work, but what are they working for, and are they working for a specific intention? And so there is a difference when someone holds a space, and who are they? Who is that person? What's their energetic resonance? What's the field of energy that person contains? And the relationship that person has with that field of energy, that form of practice of medicine. That will influence hugely the people that are under the influence of the medicine. So there is a big difference, and the intention of wanting to work with the medicine, and I refer to medicine as the psychedelic here, I'm talking in my context more of ayahuasca, that the recreational part, in fact ayahuasca is terrible for a sort of recreational event, it's not a kind of party.
Not recommended.
Yeah, it's not a party thing. So, but a lot of people come to it in a more relaxed way. That is also okay. But actually, to work with it in a ceremonial setting and to work with it with a healing purpose, then you really have to be kind of conscious of who are the people and what is the context in which it's being used. And so there are subtleties in that dialogue that science and medicine can't grasp, because these are not measurables that form that same kind of sort of way of looking at reality. And so the differentiation of the way in which I use the term a shamanic practitioner, but loosely here for other people also not necessarily from the shamanic umbrella, which are working with energy or working with a broader understanding of reality, working with an understanding of multiple layers of reality, of worlds, etc., of forms of energy that are not visible. Those components form a really important part of the work, and so there is that relationship with the energetic field, which then is correlated to the music, is correlated to the drum or to the rhythm, is correlated to kind of the oneness of the practitioner with with the person who's in that medicinal space, and how is that kind of one aspect kind of being worked out in order for that progression of the healing.
This is very interesting that you mentioned this, I think, because I think Mark is raising this interesting question of, could you replace the tribal drumming that you experience in a ceremony with, some kind of DJ-produced beat, for instance, or something else, something that's able to achieve the same effect physiologically, perhaps, or just has the same, musical structure as something that you experience in a ceremony. Importantly, without the religious heft beneath it. So it's interesting, Ricardo, that you mentioned the interplay. Yeah, well, not just intention, but also the interplay between energy, right, and drumming and all the other aspects of ceremony. And you also mentioned this is something that's very hard for science and medicine to codify. So for you, is this something that is understood purely at the level of intuition? Do you I guess the underlying question here is, what is the role of uniquely, the religious aspect of ceremony in cultivating energy, intention, etc.?
Thank you. Good question. We just need to clarify the word religion a little bit to kind of make it a bit more loose, because obviously none of this is a kind of sort of dogmatic definition of religion. Let's say a form of practice, and I think what I'll be speaking next is shamanic, from my shamanic experience. Although I'll weave in a bit of Tibetan Buddhism at some stage as well.
Do they have I don't know much about Tibetan Buddhism. Do they have priests?
We have lamas.
Okay.
I'll weave that into that.
Thank you.
I think what is important in that is the hollow bone. The concept of the hollow bone is really important here. Is that the person who is energetically conducting the space is meant to be hollow, in the sense that the person, their identity, their concepts, their principles, their right and wrong, their understanding of this world needs to step aside, the ego needs to step aside, to allow for, right, what's called the energy to work through, right, and the spirit work through, or however we want to call it. That's really important. So there is a complete stepping aside from what I think should happen. And my idea about this, and what book I read, and what I learned about and I experienced some time ago. And completely, you cannot be a serious practitioner if you are in the middle of that narrative. And so that's a really important aspect. Is being able to allow for that kind of dance, right, to take place. And then there's something that is beyond human that is taking place in the relationship. The person, let's refer to it, or the people, are in a shared container of the medicine, right? They kind of open up to this energetic field, and then how that energetic field is in play with the people that are conducting the ceremony is where it really kind of takes place. So it's like everyone steps into a spaceship, and we all take off in the spaceship, and when everybody's in the spaceship, then there will be something that will take place, and there will be a container in which certain things are going to form part. What comes through, that is also important. So what is the intention of the ceremony, right? So what is being called? So in working with ayahuasca and in a ceremonial setting, there you can have different themes, nuances. You can call upon certain qualities for a certain output. And so, if I now kind of weave in a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan Buddhism is built on shamanism, right? The Himalayan shamanism of the Bon tradition. So a lot of similarities in shamanism and Tibetan Buddhism are present there. That's why Tibetan Buddhism is a little bit more esoteric, if you want, on the kind of spectrum of Buddhism. And there they have deities, right, or aspects of mind, or you can see kind of very rich images, Tibetan Buddhist images, if you're familiar with that kind of imagery, which are qualities or states of mind, or sort of energy fields, or so on. So when you relate, like in Tibetan Buddhism, to a particular space of activity, certain quality, you are bringing to your consciousness, to your awareness, that energy. Right? So you're actually, a mantra is almost, if you want, a calling. It's a calling of a certain quality. Right? It's called compassion. I want the kind of the aspect of compassion to work through me. Yeah? And so Om for example, is a very common, well-known mantra. And that's a bridge, right? That's a calling, it's a song, that's an opening of an energetic field that you want to connect with. So you, out of the vastness of space, you are making a particular, I want the aspect of compassion, of loving kindness and compassion to manifest here, work through me. Yeah, so it's that intention that I want this to happen now, and I want it to be of compassion. Equally, someone with lesser intentions or trained in a different way can use these practices with the shamanism in a witchcraft manner and call upon negative aspects. Because that can also manifest in the totality of reality. Yeah, the total reality is not made of just of goodness. Yeah, so hence why the importance of who is it that's holding the ceremony and how clean is that individual, so that when this energy comes through, it's not being picked up by the person's wounds, by the person's faults and traumas and negativity. Yeah, so the person who's practicing needs to be really well clean. They've done their work, so they're not putting in the space all their insecurities and all their traumas and all that kind of stuff, because that's what's going to navigate through into the pot.
Right. So what I'm hearing from you is that you become a channel or a vehicle for an energy that is outside of you to become expressed within you. So I'm curious, Nikki and Mark, firstly about the ritualistic or ceremonial consumption of psychedelics in either Christianity or paganism, and secondly, whether these ideas of becoming a conduit for an energy that's outside of you resonate in your respective faiths.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I remember several times sort of stepping up in a room full of a congregation, for want of a better word, and stepping forward in front of people, stepping into the circle, and it's like you disappear, and then something else is. It's not quite the right words, but something else is using you, something else is inhabiting your body and your voice and your thoughts and working through you. And it's what needs to happen in that moment. It's what the universe needs to say through that. That's the language that I would use rather than energy. So it's the universe, the spirit of that moment, that place, speaking through you and saying what needs to be said at that time. And when that happens for the first time, it's quite strange. You have to sort of just like let that happen. It's like sort of being lifted up and set down at the same time. There's a sort of spatial awareness to it. That's not necessarily a psychedelic thing. That's just what happens in that particular religious context. So I totally recognise that. The idea of the hollow bone is a very nice, vivid metaphor for that.
Really nice. Yeah, I like that a lot.
It calls to mind as well the idea of some of the early Christian fathers, where they were upset because the people that were teaching that were promoting the teachings of Christ, they were described as the empty canals rather than the living rivers.
Waterless clouds, was it?
It's more like it's like a channel that's run dry. And the idea was that they were teaching just the rituals, but without the soul,
right.
Without being that. Letting that come through without
praying to be seen. Yeah.
So yes, and it is right that the person that's leading in a pagan type of ceremony, I can only speak again, as all of us probably would say this, we can only speak from our own lived experiences. We're not speaking. There isn't like an organised book of paganism where they say this is what you do on these things. Well, there are, but they all disagree. So from my own experience of pagan ceremonies, and also within the context of chaos magic and things like this, the psychedelic ceremony will be definitely with an intent, and it will be quite often to do a healing ritual, to send out energies to people to heal them, or to sometimes they're a bit more rather than for a specific person. An example, I was trying to think about a good example to tell you all about today, and an example is, and I can't quite remember it properly, so this is like a slightly reconstructed version of it, but many years ago we decided to do a ritual to make the land fit for bees to live in. So the way that we decided to do this in our sort of slightly jokey way is to really throw ourselves into being empathic with a bee. So you do this by pretending to be a bee. So you buzz, and you go around and have like a sting behind you, which is a thing tied around your waist. So there's a sting behind you. And you go around and you go to the different parts of the room where there are flowers set up with little drinks, and you drink the nectar, and then you take it to another room where there's a sort of corner of the room where there's a hive set up, which is basically a table with a cloth over it. And you take the nectar there and sort of, like metaphorically, you sort of like take it there. So the idea is that you're really empathising with the bees and understanding how important it is that they have flowers that they can go visit and a hive that they can go back to, but you're embodying this wisdom in a playful way, like you would do at school in a sort of drama kind of thing. But you're really getting it and really understanding it, and you're going through this, and so that's the basic structure of the ritual, which is, as I say, a bit silly. But imagine some of the people after that are quite sort of affected by this. Now, I understand the whole thing. In ecology, there's a whole, and in many other anthropological things, there's this idea of the participant observer. And the idea is that by taking part in whatever this thing might be, you're understanding it much better. That's the anthropological thing. And the idea in ecology is, it's not called that, but it's the idea that you put yourself into the mindset, into the perspective of the organism that you're trying to study. So you're understanding the world using the type of sensory apparatus that they would have, and understanding the cues that they might use. So if you're pretending to be a bee, as an ecologist, you would understand that you're looking at the way that the hedgerows are, and the way the sunlight is, all of the things that comes into it, and how important those are to make a place that's a bee would like to be in.
Yeah. I think this is extraordinary. Sorry.
So imagine doing that, and how powerful that is, but then doing that, having taken the sacrament first in a very serious way, and standing around in quiet, and making the intention, it is our intention to do this ritual to make the land fit for bees, and then passing this around and being really serious about how very deadly important it is that we have this happen. And then doing this very silly thing, and you're slightly sort of coming up. It's not like you wouldn't do it so much that you couldn't remember your name, so it would be pointless. So you just do a tiny bit to enhance your engagement in that, because one of the things about psychedelics is that they make you very much in the here and now. You drop all that baggage, you drop your identity. You can much more enter into the drama and the psychodrama of that moment, which is what happened back in Greece in the mystery traditions there. You would be using this very similar kind of, probably not with bees, probably this very similar sort of psychodrama of entering into becoming a mythological character and going through this lived theatrical experience. So that's one slightly odd way of doing it. But then there would also be other ones that were much more about just reverencing the time of the year. So standing in a circle and just like going through the night, maybe drumming, doing rounds of prayers, and taking very much of the structure learned from the peyote ritual of the Native American Church, which I've learned from various practitioners of that tradition who taught me how to do this with peyote. But you can use other psychedelics and slightly adapt it. But this idea of having, so you're all sitting in a space and you have the rounds of prayers and the incense and the beautiful focus in the middle of the altar, which is flowers, candles, incense rising, all these things, and having that orchestrated as a really beautiful event that you go through and travel all together through the night, your individual selves, and also in community with each other. But doing it with the idea of the nature spirituality as the centre of this. I think it would probably, from having attended various traditions, ceremonies throughout my life, which I've been very honoured and blessed to do so, they look quite similar to each other, practically, because you have flowers, candles, nice things, maybe some crystals, maybe not, but you have like people have cushions to sit on because it's a bit more comfortable. And there's sort of certain things which are practically quite similar to each other. And then a bit of singing, and there's a bit where people cry, and there's a bit where people laugh, and all of those kind of things. And for me it's important to have live music. Unless I'm actually at a rave, then whatever. But if I'm actually in a ceremony, I massively prefer to have live music because it is so much more responsive and it has that slight analog feel, so it's not quite so mechanical. It's much more real.
This is very interesting because I think we all know that psychedelics facilitate this feeling of interconnectedness. But there are these culturally and spiritually specific manifestations of interconnectedness. So, Ricardo, you were talking about the the manifestation of interconnectedness that is specific to Tibetan Buddhism, where you become a vessel or conduit for compassion or some kind of energy outside of you. Nikki, we were talking about embodying an aspect of nature, like the bees. Mark, I'm curious what you see as the culturally specific.
Yeah, the hollow bone.
Yeah.
It's a great image. So, what's funny about the Native American church? The practitioners there are called roadmen, which if you're from London, fanny pack, offering you cat, but they don't. So that's not who they are. They're incredibly highly trained practitioners who it's deeply humbling what they do, and together with the 4 other celebrants, the fireman, the water woman, doorman or woman. So, always in the Native American church ceremony, there's a collective intention which is set to about intention, and sometimes that's to heal this particular person's trauma or alcoholism. Often in among Native groups, that's what it is. Sometimes it's just a more general intention. So before I went travelling, there was strange semi-synchronicity that the whole intention for everyone was to navigate the world in beauty. And ever since then I've stopped stomping. I used to stomp. I have quite like cavernous...
Is that why you're not wearing shoes?
Probably, yeah. No, I've always not worn shoes inside, but I mean like even without shoes I used to stomp, and ever since that I just subconsciously stopped stomping. But that's unintentional. If we're talking about intentional, I mean it's intentional, but without realising it being intentional. I mean, another example would be on Good Friday, when the Santa Daime Church, which is a Christian ayahuasca church, have their ceremony. They sing only hymn books from the women, and that's because women were the only witness to the resurrection. Women were the only witnesses to the resurrection, even though women couldn't be witnesses in their Jewish court of law. And that's the kind of slight peculiarity of the oldest gospel, is that women were the first people to see the risen Christ. And so for that reason, in the Santa Daime Church, where people basically drink ayahuasca and sing hymns, and in every other ceremony all year, they'll usually sing the hymn of Maestro Ireneo, who's their prophet, their founding guy, who's a guy. But this time, on that particular day, it's just women's hymn books. And the hymns are received, right? They're said to be received. So when you've been in Daime for a while, you start to receive hymns. What was really bizarre was we were singing the hymn book of the wife of the Padrino in question. So the Madrino of the basically the female leader of the ceremony. And what was really crazy for me was that even though that is a very local thing, she didn't publicise it. Not basically no other Daime churches than that particular one sing that hymn book. And it's about 5 or 6 hymns. It's quite a short hymn book, but beautiful. And I started singing from the beginning to the end these hymns like I've been singing them for centuries. It was, I mean, yeah. And just because I had the intention that I wanted to sing along. And that's bizarre on many levels. It can't even be explained by, Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance stuff, because that hymn book hadn't really been sung before except by this lady. And it was
just to be clear, you weren't given the musical notes.
Oh no, I hadn't practiced it.
Right.
It was I probably should have, but I hadn't. And yet the collective spirit took possession of me, and I sang it. So psychedelics, I think they neither. But the psychedelics themselves, or entheogens, they neither necessarily connect one with divinity directly, and nor does their absence preclude the possibility of a direct incorporation. I would say it's important to remember. So during my first ayahuasca experience, I received exactly 0 visions. But rather than disappointment, I remember feeling a deep curiosity, because I've been reading, and I am a visualizer. So I'm not, when some people take psychedelics, they don't have visuals, they have other things that go on. But I am a visualizer, so it's very bizarre. And I felt elevated at having spent 8 hours worshipping whom they called the Reina de Floresta, the Queen of the Forest, but confused about what all the visionary fuss was about. And then when I checked my phone, I saw it, I think I've told you this story, I saw a message from my mother, who did not know what I'd been up to all day. And it was an edited version of the Lord's Prayer, which, as some of you know, starts with Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed. But it started with Our Mother. So I'll just say, maybe I'll say that prayer. So, Our Mother, who art in forest, hallowed be thy name. Thy forest queendom come, thy will be done, dusted, in heaven as on earth. Give us this day our daily blueberries, mushrooms, and being. Forgive us our trespasses as others forgive us. Tempt us to good. For thine is the queendom, tree, power, and glory, forever and ever. Amen. And that was all the vision I needed. You know, so what, I didn't get visuals. My mum didn't know what I was up to and sent me that, even though I've been worshipping the divine feminine all day. It's like, what's going on? So, my most powerful actual vision happened at Eleusis, actually. So you mentioned Eleusis, where they recently discovered a similar cult in northern Spain. Did you hear about this? Eleusis was a cult of Demeter and Persephone, so it's a death, rebirth cult and a harvest cult. It's a long myth, but basically Hades semi-abducts, semi-seduces, it's a bit ambiguous, blurred lines, I guess, Persephone down into the underworld, and she's kind of quite happily down there, but she wants to see her mum again, so then comes the summer, and every 6 months of the year she goes back down to Hades, and that's the agreement. So, in this vision that I had, I didn't take a pinch of any psychedelic at all. All I did was intone the myth. Basically, I read the myth on the way there. And it was the, to be fair, it was the equinox. So it was the time of year when the ceremony would have happened on the ancient Greeks and Proto-Greeks. I mean, the Mycenaeans would have done this ceremony. It's an ancient temple that dates to the early Hellenic, almost pre-Hellenic times. Very archaic. And yes, what they discovered. So I didn't finish the story. In northern Spain, they discovered fossilized ergot. So they were using an LSD-like substance in a barley brew with probably mint to calm the stomach and other things. There's actually archaeological evidence for it now. Before it had just been clutching at straws, were they trading mushrooms from the Druids in the north or whatever. But actually there's now evidence that these particular Demeter Persephone cults were using this kykeon drink, which involved a form of ergotized barley. So I didn't have any ergotized barley, or even any LSA or LS anything, no lysergamide at all. But because I'd read this vision to myself, and then at the amphitheatre there, I'd read it as if there was an audience, as evocatively as I could. In English, to be fair, not Greek. But and I'd left out one thing. I don't think Zeus is the greatest and the best. So that's the bit I left out. Just as a Christian, I couldn't stomach that. But I did call Hades the one who receives many guests, which I think is a really lovely innuendo. So I just read this hymn basically, and then when I went into the telesterion, which is the center of the cult, where the epopteo, or the beholding, would have happened. I wrote one of the best poems of my life as a response to this vision that kind of gripped me. So the greatest lesson I've learned from these is that the baseline mind is often the place which is most receptive, the baseline mind. And when I confessed to my priest, or not to my priest, to a priest, that I'd rediscovered Jesus on LSD, and couldn't help seeing Christ in others, she recommended that I go to church with and without LSD, both the regularity of repatterning and the sudden refreshing rewiring of our minds are important. And when Rudolf Zehner, who's the great Oxford critic of the hippie movement, in the 1960s, he was at All Souls. He was a comparative religionist, but also a Roman Catholic, very, very pious Roman Catholic. He argued he took mescaline in the wrong way. He did loads of things wrong. I think if he'd done a ceremony, for example, he would be saying slightly different things. But one thing he said strikes true, I think, regardless of his own problems and biases, and it's more difficult to have the sober rhythm of a regular sacrament to change you than a tab of acid, which inevitably will change you. And that's not to say a tab of acid will be easy, it will be difficult, but we must not lose sight of the work it takes to turn the states into traits or the experience into life. No human is an island. It's not all, and a lot of the discourse is heavily individualized, I think. And, when the surprises really come, the lessons are learned often with the help of other people. And so with this, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Ivo Andrić, and then I'll shut up for a bit. Searching for what I need, and I don't even know precisely what that is, I went from person to person. And I saw that they together have less than me, who has nothing. Yet I left to each of them a bit of that, which I don't have, and which I've been searching for.
I'd love to continue talking actually about this question of taking things from a state into a trait, and specifically the role
That's
of
not me, that's John Horgan, by the way.
Yes.
Rational mysticism.
Yeah. But we have been having about an hour of moderated discussions, and we are actually running a bit over time, so I'd like to leave 20 minutes now for questions from the audience.
Reggaeton question.
Hi there. Can you very clearly delineate the differences and similarities between religious experiences, as noetic experiences, and psychedelic experiences?
I don't think I could. I could describe sort of phenomenologically what the differences were, but the sort of the fundamental underneath it of it is quite hard. So let me try that. I would say that the psychedelic experience is something that I would describe primarily in terms of the perceptual changes that happen, whereas the religious noetic one is more that doesn't even make kind of because it's slippery, isn't it? Have you got an idea?
Categories are slippery. Would you like to give it a go? I've got an idea, but you give it a go.
Here we go. I think a religious experience is when you're touched by something that is really meaningful, that is beyond the self, that is a feeling I've connected with God, or I've connected with something way beyond what I could create myself. I think that opportunity, that there's an opening, that something blesses you, something really shows you or gives you an inner experience that is profound. And I would say that the entheogens do the same. Right? Around the entheogen, I'm using particularly the word entheogen in this context, because around it, of course, is a lot of tumbling, a lot of comfort, discomfort, and neurosis that goes along with that. But there is a clear opportunity in the experience of the entheogen, the psychedelic, to provide you with an opportunity to feel something which is really profoundly about the nature of reality, of existence, of yourself, of God. And so I think they both are the opportunity to give you that doorway. And I think the institutionalization or the collection of teachings which become a religion, right, are stepping stones, are methods, are approaches towards being able to sense that blessing, to sense that level of experience. Here, psychedelics is used more kind of in a cowboy way than in a religious way, because other religions are being a bit more pragmatic about how that experience can occur, whereas psychedelic is kind of more rough in that sense. But I think they both give you the opportunity to experience that.
Thank you. I think authenticity might be one way to look at it, and another way might be etymologically, so anything that reveals your mind to you. But a great book on this, and he actually references LSD, is W.T. Stacy's Mysticism and Philosophy, and he distinguishes between, among other things, extroverted and introverted religious experiences or mystical experiences. I think he says extroverted and introverted mystical experiences, but you could even apply that to religious experiences. So namely, an introverted experience would be stimulated by a lack, stimulated by a lack of light or a lack of hearing or a lack of the social. So going into the wilderness for 40 days or doing spirit quest or whatever might be an introverted one, whereas psychedelics, when they are religious experiences, are more extroverted ones because they would stem from a sheer overplus of perception. And they would also fit into things like dancing and drumming, and psychedelics are in that group of religious experiences. Does that make sense? So you have the types of religious experiences which stem from withholding or restricting something, and thus and the types of religious or mystical experiences that come from overstimulus. But I don't think every psychedelic experience, as I'd agree with you, I don't think every psychedelic experience is necessarily religious. I actually did a study of the varieties of psychedelic experience by masters in Houston, and I think 90% of their psychedelic experiences, don't quote me on that, but I think it was 90%, use some form, at least once, of religiously couched language, but that doesn't mean that the whole form of the experience is necessarily religious, and there were that 10% that entirely were not. Like, I don't think that the girl in window winking at me is necessarily a religious experience. For example, and you have experiences like group mind experiences, so I think, psychedelics, when they are religious, would fit into that extrovertive, mystical strain, but they're not always religious, and also there are plenty of religious experiences that don't require psychedelics, if that makes sense. There are loads of other ways to pick it apart. Authenticity is definitely one way to look at it as well. But yeah, it's an interesting question. The categories will always dissolve though.
Follow up there.
Yeah.
Do you think they share a common psychological mediator?
I mean, there's always DMT knocking around, right? It's like endogenous. And yeah, I'm sure there are loads of theories that whether it's extroverted or introverted, methods that it's kind of you're stimulating some gland in the gut or the pineal, which is overexciting your endogenous 5-MeO or NMDMT stuff. So on a base physicalist answer, perhaps, yeah, but I don't know.
And going back to the things we were talking about earlier about stepping aside, anything that makes that happen is going to make a religious experience more likely. And that could be a behavioural thing. So looking at it from a purely sort of chemical basis is incredibly hard, and possibly not really what we're trying to talk about.
A little bit
We're
banal,
talking about the sort of the stance that one has, both physically and physiologically and psychologically, and it's getting to that stance point of stepping away from and seeing the beyond yourself, being touched by that thing that's beyond yourself. And letting that come through, and having that religious experience where everything is suddenly alive and vivid and meaningful. That's one of the sort of marks of that particular state, and that can be, in certain circumstances, can be push yourself into that, or be pushed into that using the psychedelic substances. So they can overlap in that kind of mechanistic kind of way. But I think that might be the more useful language rather than
I agree.
looking at the.
And in fact, you just reminded me, sorry, can I just jump in because I forgot one aspect of the introverted extroverted definition. It's also in the phenomena of what's encountered. So the introverted will be generally absolute nothingness, whereas the extroverted will be absolute everythingness. So it's whether yourself is extinguished or expanded into the universe, if that makes sense. So there's also a phenomenological side to that distinction. And I think actually psychedelics can be both in that, yeah. Can be both.
Yes, yeah, let's go for more
Yeah,
questions.
you go.
Those are questions.
Tom?
Which one? Who wants to speak about that? Maybe your name and what you do here?
My name's Tom.
We can keep our answers brief so we can try and get.
Yes, yeah. I'm doing a creative writing part-time masters at the moment in my second year. So I'd like to posit the idea that modern society is lacking in ceremony and ritual. And so the question I'd like to put to you guys, and feel free to answer as quickly as you like, is do you think that the answer to that problem lies in embracing the ceremonies that have been bequeathed to us, that have been passed down, in the way that people have embraced ayahuasca ceremonies in South America, for example, or in the creation of new ceremonies? And again, I guess it comes to your question of authenticity, because it's quite hard to have an authentic, the beat, for example, fantastic ceremony, but you can't claim that it has a 2,000-year religious tradition necessarily. So the simple question is, should we make up some new ceremonies for our new psychedelic society, or should we embrace those that have been bequeathed to us? Thank you.
Such a good question. Thank you.
It's kind of like kind of both, isn't it? Obviously, so we can't. If you want to sort of reinvent the wheel, possibly a good way to start is to look at wheels that already exist and then learn from what the terrain is that you've got that the wheel needs to go over. So you're looking at other things. This is very much what I've done throughout my ritual and ceremony leading life, is that I've tried to learn from what exists already in the world in different traditions, and then having engaged with that on quite a reasonably deep level for a few years in each occasion, and then stepping back and going, so what can I learn to invent new things, but taking some of the principles and some of the mechanics of those ceremonies. So I think it's important to constantly reinvent it, otherwise you can end up in that sort of museum state where folk music can just be a repetition of the old things. It's important to make up new folk songs as well.
I don't know if you want to just one person answer each question, or just to kind of accelerate the answers.
Yeah. Why don't we have each of you answer this question, and then we'll
Okay, we'll start doing that. Do you want to go next? Okay. Such an endless question about that. The background in theology, I could answer that in so many different ways. But yeah, I mean, we're constantly reinventing tradition, and that's the irony, right? There is no pure religion. I mean, Judaism itself, I mean, Christianity harkens back to Judaism, which harkens back to a mixture of like Semitic, Egyptian and even Zoroastrian origin, and everything's always mixing. And the Native American Church, for example, takes from very, very ancient traditions, but it in its current form only started in the late 1800s. And same with Sans Daime. It takes from very ancient but Kardecist, spiritualist, Catholic, and ayahuasca shamanic origins, but it melds them together. And if that could happen in the late 1800s, I don't see why that's such a unique historical time. We're in a very unique historical time now. And so yeah, the ritual of Nikki sounds awesome. Love it. Nevertheless, I mean, if you actually look at the history of the 60s, I can't remember the name of the guy who started the Neo-American Church, but he tried to get federal legalization for LSD in the same way the Native American Church did since 1914 had legalized. I think it's 1914, right, Julian? But
yeah, it's been in and out.
Between 1914 to 1970, it's been a battle, but peyote is legal for the Native American Church on the basis of freedom of religion. Now, why did it not work for the Neo-American Church? And I mean, I think he testified to the Nixon government and said something like about flying purple hippos, and it just kind of put them off. So, like, you tread carefully. And also, I think when you do have someone who genuinely founds a new religion, they have this really strange combination of deep intelligence and utmost humility. And that's very rare these days. And there are people who are trying to found new traditions. I'm just thinking of the most extreme ones, but Manson, Aum Shinrikyo, the current horror with Ayahuasca International, there are people who have used that power. So I think giving up power is quite important in all of this. And when you look at people who have founded lineages that last, they do have that combination. Not just religious charisma, not just a way with words, not just an inspiring capacity, but actually a walking the walk as well, And that is actually genuinely rarer than we think. And new religions form not just from charisma, but also from cultural stress. So I think, the time is right, but you need to find a genuinely good person. I don't know.
And I concur completely with what is said, just not to add and repeat the same, just to add something. I just want to make a reference to Michael Harner, who was
Way of the Shaman?
The Way of the Shaman, and in his life work of 60 or so years as an anthropologist and someone who travelled the world and looked at what shamanism is and synthesized from all these travels, from going to all people that would have a shamanic activity across all different cultures. He recognized that there was something that was very common that all of them had, which was the drum. And so there's something really beautiful about the simplicity of what ceremony and ritual can be. And it's something that is used interculturally and geographically completely distant from each other. That does mean that there is a meaning to the ceremony. There is a meaning to the ritual that is timeless. Yeah? And so there's a timeless nature of the activity, which I think is important to recognize. Because we think we're, of course, very, very important in living our life now, but in the time span of existence, it's nothing, right? So what are the things that are really, really timeless? And what are the timeless teachings? I think that's where we need to really kind of go down to. And what are the things that connect us to that absolute authenticity, right? The unbrokenness of truth. When you find that, then you really recognize that there's a timelessness in it. And the way in which you access it is also as such, and what's the methods to do that. And these methods have been surviving and coming across our times as the ones that are really prevalent and exist now, the ones that have been around for so many centuries and decades and so on. And so the new practitioners creating their new religions and their new waves, time will tell if they are really kind of to hold. So I prefer kind of going back and seeing what did the ancestors do? What did the old people, the old kind of people, what can I learn from them? Just to kind of throw in here a nuance about the sweat lodge. So every month we hold the sweat lodge. Absolutely beautiful event. And we call upon the spirits of the elements, and particularly grandfathers, right? The stones, the rocks. Teach us, talk to us, show us the way. And we pray towards that, pray towards that understanding of something which is of millions of years. It's been here and endured much more than any humanity could imagine. So let's learn from that and create our ceremonies to connect to something which is happening.
Two more questions. Yes.
To what extent do you see the psychedelic renaissance as undermining or the strict demarcation of major religions?
Nikki, do you want to take that one?
I didn't quite catch the end of that.
So you said, to what extent do you see the psychedelic renaissance and its implications as undermining or dissolving mainstream religions? Did you say mainstream?
Dissolving the boundaries.
Dissolving the boundaries between mainstream?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, that's
yeah.
a very interesting
Okay, that's
question.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I can understand that. So one of the things about the approach of the psychedelic renaissance is that it's looking at a lot of the disparate cultures and religions around the world that use entheogens and various other sacraments. And one of the sort of the things is the idea of this sort of comparative looking at stuff, and then as we've been talking about today, sort of picking up the commonalities between that, and that is going to blur those boundaries because you're looking at those like the physiological and the practitioner and the pragmatic states of what we're doing. Is this the kind of thing that you're asking, or am I slightly on the wrong track?
Maybe I'm thinking of ecumenicism, is that the right word?
Ecumenism.
Ecumenism, yeah. Or,
So on that particular topic, just check out Bill Richards, William Richards. He's giving high dose psilocybin experiences to religious leaders to help them understand one another's perspectives better. Now, I really, really, really love that research, but and this isn't a big but I think the disagreement between religions tends to happen more among the laity, more on the ground, and is kind of a tribal thing. Often, you have the Dalai Lama and Rowan Williams next to each other, happy, clappy.
And that's been the case throughout history.
Yeah.
Mostly religions have got on with each other. It's only when people that are trying to manipulate people use those religions to manipulate them that they end up.
Exactly.
But mostly people have respected each other's beliefs.
Yeah.
By and large. It may not look like that from history and the history of war, but that's that aspect that gets recorded.
Yeah, I think faith and religion is often used as an inspiration for peace, but an excuse for conflict. So if you want a real reason and to authenticate the reason that you don't like another group, you'll use religion. But that tribalism, Soviets and Nazis did it. It's a very human thing. It's not necessarily a religious thing, but that could be my bias coming through. I can't see faith as inspiring hatred or violence in that way. But no, I mean whether the fact that mystical experience can be found in a pill undermines the kind of the exclusive space holding of the mainstream religions. That's a very interesting question. And I encountered so many interfaith chaplains in the US who've been ordained into a particular tradition, and we're now doing Native American, they were on the peyote road, as they call the Red Road, as well, and we're doing interfaith chaplaincy. And when I was a chaplain, I couldn't help but do interfaith chaplaincy because I was working in a school in London, and that's the constituency, that's the reality. We all have slightly different meta-narratives going on, and we need to accept, look for common themes in those, but also accept those differences and Because for me, what psychedelics seem to do is they seem to change three things about the individual, and those three things are obviously intrinsically social. The sensorium, or what you consider beautiful or good, can change. Suddenly you like electronic dance music, suddenly you like drumming excessively. Suddenly you're like, wow, what good is, why when you feel warm and fuzzy changes to some extent. The second thing they change is your habitus, your habits. You can change and the third thing is your plausibility structure, so what you consider could be the case. Your super plausibility changes. And I think those are all, as much as we might want to talk about non-cultural deconstruction, seeing yourself being authentic who you really are, those are all to some extent culturally filtered. And the reason different tribes develop around religions is because they have different sensorium habitus and plausibility structure. I think psychedelics are helping people to see each other's sensoria and habituses. So yeah, I think that's a good thing. But I don't think it's to be lamented, and I think the moment the Anglican Church takes a long hard look at this and actually says something public about it, with the moment I jump for joy. And I know the Ayatollah of Iran, who's the head of the Shia Muslims, has ruled psychedelics halal a few years ago, if with a religious practitioner. So psychedelics are not haram in the Shia, I think 12 are Shia Muslims, or 7, I can't remember. But some Shia Muslims, it's halal now, so there you go.
They're not regarded as intoxicating the senses.
That was his rationale.
Make them more clear.
Yeah, they don't dull. I mean, alcohol literally kills brain cells. Muslims are onto something with that one. But
So that's
yeah, exactly.
One more question. Yes, James.
So my question is more directed towards Ricardo.
Perfect.
And I was wondering, for instance, within Tibetan Buddhism style practices involved in, let's say, the 6 yogas of Naropa, which prepares oneself for transparent consciousness and for the birth and the rebirth state. And I was wondering, your use of ayahuasca, how has that helped you in terms of those states and how to prepare oneself for that state?
If you can talk briefly about what those states are as well.
Sure. So with the 6 yogas of Naropa, very briefly, are 6 practices of transformation of consciousness, transformation of who you are into other states of existence. In a very brief way of saying. So there are letting go of the self, right, is a really important aspect of working with psychedelics, and in this case also particularly ayahuasca. So this notion of letting go, what is this? How to really transcend the self and allow your consciousness to go beyond the confinement of our sense perception. So we live and experience the world according to our vessel. The body we have allows us to perceive this reality and these dimensions in accordance to that kind of the sensorial and the kind of intellectual perceptive way that's vehicled through. So when you enter into the deeper state of experience with, I would say, ayahuasca, you're able to transcend your body and morph into other states of existence, of reality, right? So body and mind are directly interlinked in our existence. So how can you then experience something beyond what is your capability? So you need to be able to transcend the physical in order to be able to have a vessel which is a different container to experience something broader and of a different nature. And so psychedelics teach you, ayahuasca teaches you, if you wish to go that way, to transcend the concept, transcend the body, transcend time, transcend all concepts. And if you're able to break through all that, to drop all those concepts, then you can experience something, of course, quite extraordinary, quite daunting as well, quite completely concept breaking. And that notion of completely letting go, when you have such moments of experience, in relation to practices like the 6 yogas of Naropa, are in that same attunement. The purpose of those practices are in line with these teachings. Right? So to be able to transform your levels of consciousness and the level of you're energetic, be able to transfer the energy that's in your system to higher states of consciousness, love, and awareness, states of joy and elation, of wisdom. And that's what those practices are. They teach you to kind of move your energies and move your body in those ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. And thank you to our panelists for joining us and for the excellent discussion. I'll just mention that we're selling some merch here, which you can get after the event is over. And we'll also be going to the pub, King's Arms, afterwards to continue the discussion. Our next event is psychedelic breathwork on Saturday from 2 to 4:15 p.m. at the St. Mary and St. John Church in Cowley. You can speak to me if you'd like to get a link to the ticket. We're also doing an arts and crafts workshop on Sunday, led by Pinky Vision, who's designed a lot of our merch. Thank you very much for coming.